and welcome to an American Talk Show. I'm your host, David Allard. I'm an attorney from Fitchburg, Massachusetts, and we have a very interesting topic today. We're talking about the First Amendment, and we have two guests. They're fairly regular guests. I'll have you introduce yourselves, Kenny.
Again, my name is Kenneth Caraba. I'm 46 years old. I am from Fitchburg, Massachusetts.
And Hal?
Hal Allard. I'm from Phillipston, Massachusetts. I'm just a computer programmer.
What we're talking about today is the First Amendment, and I'd like to read an article written by a man named Sean Whaley. He is a journalist, and he wrote an article for the Las Vegas Review. He described the situation at the Cliven Bundy Ranch near Bunkerville, Nevada. In the article, he said that when protesters arrived in Bunkerville last week to join rancher Cliven Bundy's battle against the federal government, they came angry. They were angry about how the Bureau of Land Management was treating Bundy and his family, whose cattle feeding on public land were being rounded up because of his refusal to pay grazing fees over a 20-year period. But many of them seemed even more upset about what they saw as a trampling of their First Amendment right to free speech. Some First Amendment supporters say the free speech zones, like the ones BLM set up and later dismantled after public outrage, are intended to stifle rather than encourage debate. The Federal Land Agency said that other areas in the 1,200 square mile Gold Butte closure area were off limits to people for stating their opinions. So basically there's a 1,200 square mile area, and they were limited to a small area to have their free speech. Regardless of the purpose, advocates say that such zones are an inappropriate infringement of free speech. As a quote by Janine Hansen said, "I think to have an unelected bunch of BLM bureaucrats determining where American citizens can exercise their right to free speech is an abomination." She's a member of the Nevada's Independent American Party and a candidate for Congress. It's a constitutional continuation of the violation of our basic constitutional rights by bureaucrats who are not accountable to any elected officials, he said. Samantha Harris, Director of Policy Research for the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, worked with the American Civil Liberties Union of Nevada and University of Nevada to implement a more expansive free speech policy at the campus several years ago. The creation of small free speech zones turns large swaths of public property into censorship zones, she said. Later on in the article, the Bundy's 500 cattle around Bunkerville is an accommodation to protesters. The federal government rounded up some of the cattle because Bundy refused to pay the grazing fees for 20 years. National Park Service spokeswoman Christy Vanover said Tuesday the First Amendment zones were created to promote free speech and not to be a burden. While anybody can express their free speech at any time on open public lands in accordance with the codes and ordinances that exist, there are temporary closures of some of the public lands related to the impound operation, and those are in place for public safety. So she said, "We are identifying two areas where the public could safely and conveniently express their opinions without having to go through the codes and ordinance process and apply for permits." So that was her response to the criticisms about free speech zones. So, Hal, what's your opinion about them implementing a policy where the protesters were limited to, and what do you think? Why do you think that they did that? BLM limited the speech.
Well, I think there's a lot of other things going on behind the scenes that we should probably expand upon. One being the motive of the federal government or the BLM to crack down on the Bundy Ranch, and I'd like to expand on that a little bit. So anyway, there's a senator named Harry Reid. I don't know if you heard about him, but he's been on the sounding board to get the for this project. And what's interesting about Harry Reid is that public land records obtained by Before It's News show a corporate entity partially owned by Senator Harry Reid is the owner of over 93 acres of undeveloped land within several miles of Cliven Bundy Ranch. Reid Bunkerville LLC is issued as the current owner of 4 parcels of land on the west side of Bunker Hill, which are within several miles of the Bundy Ranch. This area appears to be slated for development in the future. So what we've discovered is on this land, this Senator Reid had slated a solar panel project. So he was exposed as the mastermind behind the Bureau of Land Management prosecution of Nevada rancher Cliven Bundy. Can be seen in this March 2014 photo, breaking ground for a new solar farm near the Bundy Ranch, emphasizing that the senator's plan for solar projects in Nevada wasn't just limited to the Shell solar farm near Laughlin. It was signaling the first day of construction of the Mofia Southern Palette Solar Project, which is about 35 miles from the Bundy homestead in Bunkersville, Nevada. Senator Reid joined representatives from the MOPA band of POTUS executives from First Solar Incorporated and the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power for a groundbreaking ceremony on March 21st. So this guy, Harry Reid, he has current investigations going on that was actually obstructed by the Department of Justice. The FBI was working alongside of Utah state prosecutors in wide-ranging corruption investigations. They've uncovered accusation of wrongdoing by the U.S. Senate's most prominent figures, Majority Leader Harry Reid and rising Republican Senator Mike Lee. But the Justice Department has thwarted their bid to launch a federal investigation. So there's a lot of things going on behind the scene with Harry Reid and the motives, which brings us into the next point, which is the federal land. So does the federal government have the right to just take this federal land and build solar panels and give it to a power company so the power companies can make profit from it, right? So the federal lands are in the United States. Ownership is claimed by the U.S. federal government pursuant to Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 of the United States Constitution. As of March 2012, out of 2.27 billion acres in the country, about 28% of the total was owned by the federal government, according to the Interior Department. The United States Supreme Court has upheld the broad powers of the federal government to deal with the federal lands. So what are federal lands? Federal lands they're defined as public domain, which is lands that those that cannot be sold since they are considered to belong to the whole community. So it's land that it's allotted to the whole community. They're not under private or state ownership, since during the 18th and 19th centuries, the United States, as the country was expanding, these lands were obtained from the 13 original colonies, from the Native American tribes, and from purchasing from other countries. So I think one of the other issues is when you have public land that's allotted to the community, the federal government seems to be under the impression that they can just make rules, go in and do whatever they want with the land. So is it right for the federal government to take the public domain and use it for energy companies to give the one ownership of an energy company the distribution of land so he can build his solar panels and profit from it? And I mean, I could see the government would say, well, we're trying to help the community by giving extra power, but really you have a few people with who are filling their pockets. I mean, still the people have to pay for the energy. The energy isn't going to be free to the public. So when you talk about public domain, which is land that is for the community, that the community should benefit from it. So no matter who builds a power company, the public still has to pay for that power, right? So the public isn't benefiting really much at all, because the federal government is giving these guys land for the solar panels. So I would say, is it better that ranchers have use of the land so they can feed their cattle, or is it better that some private industry gets the land? So what if I wanted to drill an oil well on the land, and then on federal land, and then I drill and I strike oil, and then I'm making land hand over fist. Yes, they're leasing the land to me, but still I'm profiting from the federal land, which is really an allocation to the public under the public domain regulations.
That's interesting. And I'd have to ask you then, is it your belief that that these restrictions that BLM are placing on these protesters were intended to intimidate or impinge on their ability to exercise their free speech?
Well, I think that the BLM, they're thugs, right? They're just sending the thugs in to deal with the people right now.
So it seems like what you're saying is that they're trying to, although they have 1,200 square miles, they're saying you can exercise your free speech only in these isolated places where we can watch you. Does that sound right? They're trying to limit, and not only that, but you're limiting them in terms of the size of how many people can fit in these very small zones of free speech. So
they're in the desert. There's masses of land, and to put them in one central spot and say this is where you can speak is utterly ridiculous.
Right, and that's why the governor of Nevada came down and did influence them with regard to removing the zoned areas, and there was a public outcry concerning that. But this goes to a very important point. The point is, here you have a federal agency, the BLM, exercising their power to regulate the speech of citizens. And in the First Amendment is the most protected amendment. And here a federal agency, a federal body, is going to regulate their ability to protest or to speak out against what they think is inappropriate. So does this make you suspicious, seeing that Harry Reid, a senator, was involved, perhaps in terms of, it could be monetarily with regard to the solar company, maybe his influence with the BLM? Is that suspicious to you?
Well, I think that they're cracking down from the senators down. They're giving the orders to take the land, and they don't care who they have to go through to get it. Right?
What's interesting about Bundy land, it was apparently in their family for over 100 years, and the BLM has only been around for a very limited number of years, and the Bureau of Land Management comes in and starts imposing fees on all the ranchers, and they all go out of business except for Bundy. So does this tell you anything about the government's ability to regulate the citizens not necessarily in the public interest. Would you agree with that?
Well,
wouldn't it be more in the public's interest to promote the grazing of cattle? This is desert area. There's not much that can be done positively for the public except for grazing of cattle. Would support the beef industry, and Americans consume a lot of beef.
Well, again, it just comes down to greedy people who want to do greedy things, right? And they don't care if they have to push people aside to do it, right? I mean, the solar project would be big for Harry Reid, and it would be a lot of money. So they're just going to line their pockets with profit, and they don't care if they have to kill cattle or hurt innocent people, you know. And they're just sending the thugs, and the thugs think they're doing everything right? I mean, I'm sure that they're good people, that there's some legitimate people there, and they feel like they're doing the right thing because they're just taking orders, right? But a lot of them probably don't understand what those orders mean, right? They're just doing what they're told because they're paid to do it. That's their job, to go in and do those things. So I think that the people have to wake up all over as to what's happening from the top down, and to do the right thing, you know. Which is why I think that you know, the local police really have kind of stepped aside in the whole thing, because, you know.
So let me ask you, Kenny, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, when you first talked about 1,200 square feet, I did simple math.
Miles.
And 1,200 square miles, I did simple math. That's an area of 40 miles by 30 miles, which you can fit almost the two largest cities in the world in that area. And when the government said you can only protest in a certain amount of area, I don't know what you're talking the size. It seems like
there were two small, very small areas.
Like how big would you say? A square mile?
No.
Less than that?
Yeah, I think it was very small.
So it was about control, it sounds like. Of all the area that they had a right to be at, the government chooses a very, very, very small area for them to be at. It was about, seems like they wanted to control and monitor what these people were going to do. Which is what like Hal said, it's insane, it's wrong, it seems like the government wanted to make decisions for these people. It's like basically telling them what they have to do.
And what do you think of their justification? They said that they were just doing that for public safety.
No.
They identified two areas where the public could safely and conveniently.
The only way they could
opinions.
say public safety was a problem is if these people showed in the past that safety was, that the public was in a safety problem, and if that didn't happen, you can't make such those claims.
Okay, so we understand the very important thing about the First Amendment, the freedom of speech and the freedom of being able to protest, and how the government was taking action to crack down on that freedom, and how important it was to have it.
I think the public safety issue was something they used to give a made-up reason for them to say what they were saying. It's no different than sometimes the way politics work. We know it's not really off the subject, but Nancy Pelosi, in an interview a long time ago, wanted to pass a bill and told the voters, I want you to first vote for the bill, and then after you vote for it and you see it, you're going to like it. Well, shouldn't you see the bill first before you vote for it?
Right. Exactly. That would make sense. There are, and I'll read it to you, the First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of a religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So that's the First Amendment. Very important amendment. But a lot of people don't know that the government restricts speech in a lot of ways. It restricts speech with regard to libel and slander and obscenity and pornography and sedition and a so-called hate speech. which we'll get into further later, classified information, copyright violation, trade secrets, non-disclosure agreements, right to privacy, right to be forgotten, and campaign finance reform. So the government gets into speech in a lot of ways. And one way was the Espionage Act of 1917, which was endorsed and promoted by President Woodrow Wilson. In his December 7th, 1915 State of the Union address, he asked Congress for the legislation. Here's what he said. There are citizens of the United States, I blush to admit, born under other flags but welcomed under our generous naturalization laws to the full freedom and opportunity of America, who have poured the poison of disloyalty into the very arteries of our national life, who have sought to bring the authority and good name of our government into contempt, to destroy our industries wherever they thought it effective for their vindictive purposes, to strike at them, and to debase our politics to the uses of foreign intrigue. I urge you to enact such laws at the earliest possible moment, and feel that in doing so I'm urging you to do nothing less than save the honor and self-respect of the nation. Such creatures of passion, disloyalty, and anarchy must be crushed out. There are not many, but they are infinitely malignant, and the hand of our power should close over them at once. They have formed plots to destroy property. They have entered into conspiracies against the neutrality of government. They have sought to pry into every confidential transaction of the government in order to serve interests alien to our own. It is possible to deal with these things very effectively. I need not suggest the terms in which they may be dealt with. Well, one example was a case that came out called Schenck versus the United States, 249 U.S. 47, 1919. That was a United States Supreme Court decision concerning enforcement of the Espionage Act of 1917 during World War I. A unanimous Supreme Court, in a famous opinion by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., concluded that defendants who distributed leaflets to draft-age men urging resistance to induction could be convicted of an attempt to obstruct the draft, a criminal offense. The First Amendment did not alter the well-established law in cases where the attempt was made through expressions that would be protected in other circumstances. In this opinion, Holmes said that the expressions which in circumstances were intended to result in a crime imposed a clear and present danger of succeeding and could be punished. That law was extended May 16, 1918 by the Sedition Act. And that actually was a set of amendments to the Espionage Act which prohibited many forms of speech, including any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States, or the flag of the United States, or the uniform or of the Army or Navy. Those could be prosecuted as offenses. In a year after the passage of that act, famous case Eugene V. Debs, a Socialist Party presidential candidate in 1904, 1908, and 1912, was arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison for making a speech that obstructed recruiting. He ran for president again in 1920 from prison. President Warren G. Harding commuted his sentence in 1921. He served nearly 5 years. In the United States versus Motion Picture Film in 1917, a federal court upheld the government seizure of a film called The Spirit of 76 on the ground that it depicted cruelty on the part of British soldiers during the American Revolution would undermine the support of America's wartime ally. The producer, Robert Goldstein, a Jew of German origins, was prosecuted under Title 11 of the Act and received a 10-year sentence plus a fine of $5,000. During the Red Scare, 1918 and 1919, in response to anarchist bombings aimed at prominent government officials and businessmen, U.S. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, supported by J. Edgar Hoover, then head of the Justice, Department's Enemy Aliens Registration Section used the Sedition Act of 1918, which extended the Espionage Act to cover a broad range of offenses, to deport several hundred foreign-born in the U.S., including Emma Goldman, to the Soviet Union on a ship the press called the Soviet Ark. Many of them were jailed, and they were challenged based on the constitutional right of free speech. And the Supreme Court responded that the political expression constituted a clear and present danger to the government. So you can see how free speech has been used. That same act, the Espionage Act of 1917, it's had amendments, but it was used to prosecute in the 40s Communist Party members, Socialist Party members. In 1950, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were sentenced to death for giving nuclear secrets to the Russians. Several people were prosecuted. The speech that merely advocated violence could be made illegal. Under the imminent lawless action test, speech is not protected by First Amendment if the speaker intends to incite a violation of the law, which is both imminent and likely. This same Espionage Act was used to prosecute, under the Obama administration, seven Espionage Act prosecutions have been taken place in his administration, related not to traditional espionage, but either withholding information or communicating with members of the media. Out of the total 11 prosecutions under the Espionage Act against government officials accused of providing classified information to the media, 7 occurred in his administration. And he said that, well, leaks related to national security can put people at risk. He said that in a news conference in 2013. They can put men and women in uniform that I've sent into battlefield at risk. I don't think the American people would expect me as a commander-in-chief not to be concerned about information that might compromise their missions or get them killed. Jeffrey Alexander Sterling, a former CIA agent, was indicted under the Act in January 2011 for allegedly unauthorized disclosure of national defense information to James Risen.
And what is the punishment for espionage?
Well,
is it prison? Is it death? What is it in this country?
In 1917, it was I believe, the death penalty.
Okay.
In 2003, regarding his book State of War, the indictment described his motive as revenge for the CIA's refusal to allow him to publish his memoirs and his refusal to settle his racial discrimination lawsuit against the agency. He was indicted, and in April 2010, Thomas Andrews Drake, an official with the NSA, was indicted under 18 U.S.C. 793 for alleged willful retention of national defense information. The case arose from the investigations into his communications with Stephen Gorman of the Baltimore Sun and Diane Rourke of the House Intelligence Committee as part of his attempt to blow the whistle on several issues, including the NSA's Trailblazer project. Considering the prosecution of Drake, investigative journalist Jane Meyer wrote that because reporters often retain unauthorized defense documents, Drake's conviction would establish legal precedent, making it possible to prosecute the journalists as spies. Then there's the famous case of Chelsea Manning, U.S. Army private first class, convicted in July 2013 on 6 counts of violating the Espionage Act. And he was assigned in 2009 to an Army unit in Iraq as an intelligence analyst, and he had access to classified databases. In early 2010, he leaked classified information to WikiLeaks and confided this to Adrian Lamo, an online acquaintance. Lamo informed Army counterintelligence. Manning was arrested in that same year The material included videos of the July 12, 2007 Baghdad airstrike and the 2009 Grenai airstrike in Afghanistan, 250,000 U.S. diplomatic cables, and 500,000 Army reports, which came to be known as the Iraq war logs and Afghan war logs. Much of the material was published by WikiLeaks or its media partners between April and November 2010. He was ultimately charged with 22 offenses, including aiding the enemy, which is the most serious charge, which could have resulted in a death sentence. There was January 2012, John Karaku, former CIA officer and later Democratic staffer on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was charged under the Act with leaking information to journalists about the identity of undercover agents, including one who allegedly involved in waterboarding interrogations of Al-Qaeda logistics chief Abu Zubaydah. And then, of course, in June 2013, Edward Snowden was charged under the Espionage Act for releasing documents exposing the NSA's PRISM surveillance program. Specifically, he was charged with unauthorized communication of national defense information and willful communication of classified intelligence with an unauthorized person. So, first of all, there are a couple issues here. What do you feel is the problem if, say, a government employee releases information to a news network, media outlet like New York Times? What do you think, is there a problem with the government prosecuting both the employee and New York Times? Kenny?
Good question. Well, I don't know the laws completely, but I do understand. Let's say you are a federal employee, and if you're sworn as an employee, which I think a lot of them are, to not disclose information that you obtain while a federal employee, to put certain information out to the newspapers, and you violate an oath that you take, yes, I do believe they have a right to charge you federally. But the newspaper, no, the newspaper is not responsible for printing news. That's what they are in business for. I believe the person who is working for the federal government, if they break an oath that they take for the government, they should be charged, but not the newspaper.
And how do you feel about that?
Well, the way it seems is there's a couple of different issues here. One is that if somebody's exposing a government official's crime against humanity, that's one thing. If you're exposing that, you're saying, okay, well, this isn't right. The government isn't working within the lines of what they agreed to work in. I mean, it's almost like the government is crossing their own nation by certain things they do. Example would be spying on their own people and so forth. So, I mean, people could look at it different ways. I mean, you could say that the person that said it is a hero, right, for exposing the corruption of the government, and then the government is saying, well, you know, we're going to lock you up, you know, because you broke the rules, you know. So, it's a tricky situation.
What kind of problems do you run into if, like in the case of Edward Snowden, you have a government entity breaking the law and spying on millions of Americans, and he exposes that?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think would happen if he and others like him didn't expose corruption or illegalities in the government? The government's supposed to be working for the people and following the law that they're empowered
right, but
to act with.
Snowden was charged with unauthorized communication of national defense, I think, information material.
Correct.
Right, so he not only violated against people, he violated against the job that he oath not to give out that information. So I believe the government has the right to go after him. The issue, I don't believe, is not what Hal said, where what they're giving out, because that's going to be figured out in court. But when you take a federal job like Snowden, you take an oath not to do certain things. And one of them is disclose national federal information to the public or to a newspaper.
Well,
what if the government is committing a crime? The agency
I don't feel it matters, because again, I've done some research on this. The government explains that to you, that you're not to expose anything.
Yeah, but
about the government.
If someone is committing a crime, and you're with them, did you know that you can get in trouble?
Yes,
you can get prosecuted for them committing the crime if you don't report them. So the question is he a hero for reporting them for committing the crime, or is he just doing what he's supposed to do, is reporting them committing a crime, or is he a felon because he reported them committing a crime?
Dave's question was, should a newspaper be responsible for what they get as far as information from someone who...
No, that was an earlier question about the newspaper. I'm talking now, should he be prosecuted, and if he is prosecuted, what kind of check is there on the government? The government is supposed to be following the law. They are funded by Congress to follow the law, and if they are paying this employee with those funds, but if they're using those funds illegally to commit crimes against American people, and this person exposes this, what is the check on the government agencies if they don't get exposed by this?
Right. It's hard to answer. I could see a lot
Wouldn't
of
the government
views.
just keep committing more crimes, and if anybody exposes
the government
them,
does that anyways. So
they shouldn't.
I'm not saying they should be, but that's just what they do.
Can we accept that?
We shouldn't accept it, but...
So then if a person exposes them and says, hey, look, they're doing what's not right here.
Right.
They're committing crimes against you.
And when a person does that, like Edward Snowden, he finds out what the consequences are, which comes down to his oath. They tell you, we don't care if you agree with what we're doing. You have to take an oath to not disclose this information, and this is what happens when you do it. And Snowden found out what happens. I'm not saying he's wrong, but that's the consequences you pay for taking that oath and that responsibility to be whatever you are, whether you're a federal agent or you work for the government.
So now what would you do? Would you prosecute Snowden and prosecute the government for what they have done wrong? Or would you just prosecute Snowden?
I don't know. I think the government makes that decision. And of course I know that they're probably going to prosecute Snowden and nobody else, because they're not going to prosecute themselves.
So how about whistleblowers? I mean, how does this affect? It seems to
and
me that if you have a policy where you're going to sanction whistleblowers, then you're going to enhance the ability of the government
we know
to commit crimes.
Whistleblowers very rarely get far with this stuff when it involves the government.
Really get what?
Whistleblowers very rarely get far with the government. Kevin Trudeau, if you don't know the name, is a guy that wrote a book about the stuff that goes on between the FDA and the FTC. He's in prison right now for trying to expose the government. So we know what happens when you try to be the whistleblower on the government. You go to jail.
Well, the American people have a responsibility to hold the government in check. That's the responsibility of the American people as defined in the Constitution. If the government, any one of us, if we are with someone who is breaking the law, even if we're under the contract, if you sign a contract with David says, don't tell on me, and you go he robs a bank, and you're in the car with him, you're liable, you have to report him. Any one of us would get in trouble for that. Same as the government. They shouldn't be above the law.
I agree, but
they
unfortunately,
operate above the law.
The government, in a sense, is the law.
No, the people are the law.
In a sense,
the people...
I hate to admit this, the government, in a sense, they almost are the law. It's kind of sad, but true.
The government
it's almost like
out of control.
Well,
that's the government.
the framers of the Constitution said the people are the government, and the government works for the people.
True, but...
So it sounds like...
The people, Dave Allen, might feel they are the government, but in a sense, they're really not. You can believe that all you want, but the government is still the government. Government will always control the people, at least in this country. I'm not saying it's right.
But it's getting worse.
You do something wrong with the government, and you see what happens. Do something wrong against an everyday Joe, and not much happens. Welcome to America.
So it sounds like you're pretty much given up on.
I'm not giving up, but
so there's no checks on the
it
government.
just seems like I hate to say this, but you're in almost a no-win situation when it comes to the government. Whether it's federal, local, or state, you just don't win. Unfortunately, that's what I believe, because that's just what I see. Snowden's a perfect example. What happened with him?
And how
you commit
do you feel?
a bad crime against the government, you're not gonna get away with it. And if you try to expose anybody else involved with you, it doesn't go far.
So then, if nobody blows the whistle, then the government is just going to continue to do what they choose, correct?
Unfortunately, that's true.
And are you in agreement with that?
That's usually the way it is. I'm not in agreement with it, but again, I believe that you can't win with the government. That's what I believe. And it might be a lot of people watching this show might feel, no, I'm gonna stick up for what's right, and I appreciate that, and I want to, but I respect my freedom and my right as an American to do what I want without having to worry about the government. And I would rather not want to protest against the government, because I know what can happen to me. It sounds like I'm unfair, but unfortunately, we all kind of live that way. Whether we admit it or not, that's the country we live in. Agenda 21 is a perfect example.
It's a very sad assessment.
It's very sad, but it's true. It's very true, and we know that.
Al, what do you think?
Well, I think that if we stand back and do nothing and don't speak, and then we're going to end up in a situation like they had in Germany, right, where you have a dictator form right before their very eyes, and next thing you know, he's trying to destroy half the world, right, in genocide. So the people have to band together, and just as this nation, how it was formed, people need to band together and do the right thing.
Let me explain why I feel the way you do. I do, and you understand. And again, I'm not saying that the government should get away with what they do wrong when they do, but let's say I was married and I was a Snowden man, and I committed espionage against the government, or I was a spy in Russia against the U.S. and I got caught, and I came back to the U.S. and they caught me. And they won't let me go if they say, well, don't talk anymore. Well, guess what? Let's say I have a wife and 4 kids, and they say, hey, Mr. Caraba, we not only can get you, we know where your wife works, we know where your kids go to school, we know where you're from, we know this and we know that. I'm now in a position, I'm their robot. I say that because this is what the government does to people. You can't win with them. If the government's after you, they're going to find a way to either get to you, your wife, your kids, your uncle, or someone you know, and you're almost trapped in a corner where you can't get out, and you have to do what they tell you, or else. Am I saying that's right? No, but that's just how they operate. And that's what a lot of people who may be in trouble with the government face. You, as an attorney, probably know that.
Well, people that are going to make a difference are going to be the martyrs for society.
True.
And that's how you ignite people. Martin Luther King, or someone has to stand up and be the voice, and people need to band together and do something about it, right?
Isn't this a relationship? Didn't we see this with the Cliven Bundy? Didn't we see the people coming down and supporting him from many states away? Supported his right to graze his cattle, as his family's done for hundreds of years, in basically wasteland, and almost grandfathered in terms of his right to have his cattle graze there. But the thing that was interesting is there's an outcry of the public, and that came from far away to say, hey, this isn't right. So you offer a glimmer of hope for the public, whereas as I see Kenny, he lives in a reality of fear
to a point
of the government.
Yes, I won't be afraid to admit it. And it's not a fear that is always gonna be there, and I'm not gonna be a complete robot, but I kind of guess I'll ask you, what would you do if you committed a crime against the government and you worked for them and they said, well, here's what you're going to do, and or else we know where your kids go to school and so forth. Well, what do you do?
That's a good point. And I would tell you that a few hundred years ago, the Nathan Hale and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams risked their life, their fortune, to go against what they thought was a corrupt government. If those guys, if we'd lost the war, they would have been strung up. Everything they had would have been taken from them. They risked absolutely everything, which is really odd, because they were wealthy people to begin with, highly educated, wealthy people, and they put it all on the line. And they said that unless the public is constantly willing to put it on the line, you're going to have tyranny.
But we no longer have a government that runs like that.
Willing to stand
Our
up.
leaders today are not like the leaders we had 200 years ago, unfortunately.
Well, that's what the leaders are.
And we know that. Our leaders are not like the Thomas Jeffersons and the George Washingtons we once had in our country.
Those guys weren't leaders. They were members of the public. And they became leaders and took on the greatest warring nation ever in England. So, and they put everything on the line. So, you know, they looked at a very tyrannical situation, and they said, we're going to fight against it. We're not going to give up. They could have said, you know what, let's just keep our farms. You know, you can't go against the government. You know, you can't go against, nobody's ever beaten the British Army. We can't go against them. We're just a bunch of farmers. What are we going to do? And if we get caught, we're going to get killed, and we got our families to protect and our fortunes to protect. What can we do? They could have done that. It shows you how courageous they were. Ben Franklin had a saying. He said, people willing to trade their freedom for temporary security deserve neither and will lose both. And then there's a saying by Charles de Montesquieu, who said, the tyranny of a prince in an oligarchy is not so dangerous to the public welfare as the apathy of a citizen in a democracy. So that's a powerful statement. So are you in a situation now where you're an apathetic citizen in a democracy? And it's maybe not be so much apathy as fear.
I believe the whole world is like that. People live in fear, and people just want to live and not have to worry about certain dealings with the government. And that's just the way it is. I don't know if it can change. I hope it could, but I honestly doubt it.
Okay. Well, it's a very interesting topic, and thank you for coming tonight. And there's a lot more we can talk about, and we'll call it a wrap. Thank you.
Kind of makes you think of Blake, doesn't it? Makes you think of a lot of things. We're going to be in this yet, Mom.